Hello, and welcome to the Handplane Challenge. I'm Mark, your host and referee/umpire. Why am I the referee/umpire? Because there were a lot of planes manufactured that either had one significant defect that deserves to have a strike called on it, or, in a worst case scenario, the whole darn plane is so defective that it ought to be just tossed into the trash bin. And what I want to accomplish with this series is to make people aware of these defects so that they don't buy a plane that they would later regret buying. I want to note the Olympics are going on even as we speak, and here at the Handplane Challenge we're ahead of our time. We're always on TV and we never have any spectators. Okay. Today's Handplane Challenge is all about transitional planes. What is a transitional plane, you ask? Well, in about let's say about the year 1800, all planes were wooden planes. By the early part of the 20th century, you could still buy a wooden plane, but the vast majority of planes sold were metal planes. Now, that represented a transition, hence the name transitional planes. Carpenters and woodworkers, by and large, are a conservative lot. And so a lot of the guys using this kind of plane thought that it was tremendously advantageous to continue to have wood riding on the work instead of metal. Even though the metal planes had, definitely superior features, including usually a much easier depth adjustment and lateral adjustment and other things like that. Movable frogs, all sorts of things made the metal planes superior. So, this being a capitalist system, the manufacturers responded to that concern by making transitional planes. You're supposed to have the wood body riding against the work with all the best features of the metal planes. So that's where transitional planes came from. Today's challenge is going to feature 3 transitional planes. One is the Stanley 22. This is a typical transitional plane with a Bailey style adjuster. The second is a Stanley 122. This is a Liberty Bell transitional plane. And lastly, a Gage No.1 plane. I'll say more about this in just a bit. Here on the Handplane Challenge, I like, if at all possible, to compare planes of the same size. It's not always possible, but I like to do that if I can. And it turns out that the only typical Bailey type transitional plane that I have is this one. Small size, only about 8 inches long, and so that made it necessary to compare it against these other relatively small transitional planes from the other categories. Okay, I've covered the basic mechanical elements of all 3 of these categories in previous videos. But today I'm going to focus on something different. Any plane with a wood body is going to suffer from one characteristic, and that is wood moves, and wood tends to wear much more than a metal plane. So you get distortions in the wood body, warping, twisting, whatever. Maybe small, but still, for a plane to work well, the sole of the plane has to be perfectly flat, as close as can be obtained. And so occasionally you have to take your wooden plane, transitional or traditional wooden plane, and true the sole by make it flat once again. Okay, so you've been using your transitional plane 8 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sundays are an off day, and because of that, the sole is no longer flat, and you've trued it, and you've done that several times already. Every time you do that, the body of the plane is getting shorter and shorter, thinner and thinner perhaps. And inevitably then you're left with a gaping wide mouth. And so there's sort of a shortcoming of either wooden planes or transitional planes. So since we've already discussed the mechanism, the mechanics of these planes in previous videos, what I'm going to do today instead is talk about the various strategies that one could use to make the planes more like they were when they were new. How can you restore the mouth to a tighter condition, or basically something like that. Okay, one last word. This is the Gage plane. This is a Gage plane from before they were acquired by Stanley. There was confusion on the internet about whether this should be called, this is the smallest one, about whether this should be called a number 1 or a number 2. And I shared in that confusion. However, I now notice that there's a tiny little 1 stamped into the back, the heel of the plane. It's definitely a 1. It's not a scratch. That's a 1. And so I'm going to say that this is a Gage number 1. Later on, I'll refer to it as a Gage number 2. Ignore that. I'll flash a correction on the screen when that happens. So I now am convinced that this should be called a Gage number 1. Okay, let's take them apart and see how we can fix them. Okay, first up, the Stanley 22 Bailey type transitional plane. This is a type 16. There are several type studies out there. How do we know it's a 16? Stippled surface on the lever cap, lateral adjustment lever is present, stamp on the front. This front is pretty beat up, so it's hard to read, but the stamp is consistent with the type 16. And the frog screws, we're not going to look at them at this moment, but the frog screws are machine screws that thread into brass inserts. In the later type 17 plane, which was the last in the transitional series, the frog is held in with wood screws. Okay, so This plane has a few interesting features. One sort of oddball feature is the depth adjustment knob is very close to the wooden body of the plane. So close, in fact, that they had to plow a groove here in the wood body to provide clearance for the depth adjustment knob. Another interesting design feature, I thought, was the frame of the plane is actually held to the wood body by the frog adjustment screws. So the frog adjustment screws are doing double duty, so to speak. They hold the frog in and they hold the metal frame to the wood body. So the frame is held to the wood body by these two screws and the screw for the knob. Okay, in this particular plane, the cutter is almost used up, so I wasn't, this is going to, I couldn't do my normal sharpening procedure on this. I was afraid I would use up too much of the remaining room there for the cutter, so I got it reasonably sharp. But that's something to bear in mind when we do the shaving test. Okay, so as it is right now, the frog is all the way moved to the rear of the plane. As you can see, slots are all the way back. When it's like this, gaping a fairly wide mouth, the cutter is resting on the bed of the plane. If we were to want to make that mouth tighter, the mouth has gotten big by repeated truings, so you take off more and more of the bottom of the plane. The cavity here is V-shaped, so as the bed gets thinner, it works its way up this V-shaped cavity, making the mouth wider and wider. So if you want to make the mouth small again, you've got basically three options. One is to excavate a section in front of the mouth and insert a new wooden or metal piece, obviously extending a little bit further back here so that the mouth is now narrow again. I have not done that on any of these planes, so there are references and YouTube videos out there that show that, so refer to those if you want. Another option is to put a altogether new sole on the plane. You would basically cut out a thin piece of wood and just glue it onto the bottom of the plane. That doesn't work very well with Bailey type planes, because in a Bailey plane, the distance from this slot to the end of the cutter is obviously fixed, and it has to match this distance from the depth adjustment yoke tab to the sole of the plane. So if you were to glue on a new plane, a new sole, you're basically going to make this distance deeper, and it will no longer match the corresponding distance here. The only way you can attach a new sole is you would probably, in most instances, have to cut off part of the existing sole first before you put on the new sole. And at that point, you're getting into quite a bit of work. Okay, the last thing to do is to put a shim in there. Before I put the shim in, let me just sort of illustrate that if we were to move the frog forward, as I'll do right now, okay, now it's all the way forward. We'll tighten it up a little bit. All right, now if we were to just move the frog forward without doing anything, we'll put the lever cap on. It'll bear down here, pivot on the screw here, and press down on the end of the plane. So let me simulate that by just pressing down on the end of the plane. What you can see there is it doesn't really help much on the mouth opening. It would especially be so if, let me just retract the blade like you would have to do in that case. You can see that all it does is make the cutter rotate. Still pressing then against the same place, still a wide mouth opening. The better solution for a Bailey type plane is to put a shim in. Shim, insert shim, cutter on, now as you can see, especially if we were to put the cutter further out and more in the normal position, now the mouth is very small again. Voila, tight mouth. You can see, I think, the shim in there. The cutter is now solidly resting against the shim, so that should help on chatter. And you've got a tight mouth opening. So that's the one that we're going to test out in the shavings test. I think it's the preferred method for rectifying a wide mouth on a Bailey plane. We'll see how well it works. Okay, on to the 122. Okay, this is a Stanley number 122 Liberty Bell type transitional plane. It's a type 3A. We know it's a type 3A through a number of characteristics. One is there's an April patent date underneath the Stanley logo. It has a relatively plain stamp on the front, probably not going to be very visible. No eagles or anything of that nature. If we were to look underneath the frame here at the rear, opposite this point just about, then there's a B cast into the frame of the plane. All of these things are pretty much good for a type 3A plane. Okay, so if we have a wide open gaping mouth on a plane of this type due to too much flattening of the sole, we have a couple of different remedies. One is we can do the same thing as I described on the 22. We can excavate a section out in front of the mouth and put a new wooden or brass piece there, extend it closer to the mouth, and sort of restore a tight mouth. As I said before, I didn't do that on either of these planes. It's a fair amount of work, and it's one of those things that's totally irreversible, so not my favorite thing to do. The other option, which is possible with this plane, is to put a completely new sole on. And that's what we've done. You can see that there's about a 3/16 inch thick piece of walnut attached to the sole. Word to the wise, don't use walnut, it's too splintery. So if I ever decide to work on this some more, I'll probably change that out for something else. The reason we can do that in this case is, unlike the Bailey, and I should mention here that one thing that's consistent with the Type 3A is the tab for the depth adjustment lever, for depth adjustment mechanism, is attached to the cap iron and not the cutter. Previous 1 through 3 types had that attached to the cutter. So the reason we can do that is add the sole more easily in this case is that, unlike the Bailey type plane, the distance from the depth adjustment tab to the end of the cutter is not so fixed. This cutter, this tab, can be put anywhere. There's about a 1 inch long slot here, and that can be moved anywhere in that slot. So now this distance is variable, so when you add your new sole and you make the distance from here to the sole now larger, you can move this tab to compensate for it. So it makes adding a new sole a much easier proposition. Alrighty then. I think that's all we're going to say about the 122. Next up is the Gage No.1. Okay, here's the Gage No.1 plane, smallest plane that John Porteous Gage made. Dead giveaway on the No.1 Gage is this metal plate here that the tote is fastened to. That was only put on the No.1 plane. If there's a type study, I'm not aware of it, so I don't know exactly when it was manufactured. Okay, so we've covered the gauge depth adjustment mechanism in a previous video. Not going to do that again, so refer to the previous video if you need to. On the different ways of modifying the mouth, basically there are none. Because of the way the gauge plane is designed, obviously the mouth is dictated by the frame of the plane, and you have this large, basically metal plane-like area around the cutter, so it's going to have the intrinsic mouth opening of any gauge plane. That said, you might run into a situation where you've still needed to true the bottom of the plane. The rest of the wood part is still going to move, so you may need to true it a number of times. And if you do, well, there's two solutions. One is they thoughtfully put a lot of adjustment in their planes, so the frame of the plane can move up or down by loosening these two screws here. We'll do that and demonstrate. So you can basically you can move it. Let's try to get it all the way up. That looks like about it, I would say. There we go. Alright, so you can move it that far up in the wooden body of the plane. So in this particular case, there's a solid 1/4 inch plus that you can continue to take off the wood body of the plane before you run out of adjusting room. So if you in fact do that, and you've now got the body so skinny well, it would be a trivial thing to go ahead and re-sole the plane. As long as you can cut out a square where the frame goes, you're good to go. So of all the 3 planes, this one is the easiest one, in my opinion, to adjust for multiple flattenings of the sole. Okay, let's move on to the shaving test. Okay, let's take a shaving. We're going to start with the Stanley 22. As you remember, it had a very limited life left in the cutter. I didn't sharpen it like I normally would have because there was not very much cutter left to work with. I think I've got it okay to do a shaving test. Let's try it out and see what happens. And then we're going to test closing up the mouth to see what that does. Yeah, I got it sharp enough to do that well. One thing I'll say is my board is not perfectly jointed here. There's a low spot in the middle on the right hand side. I just didn't have the energy to get it perfectly flat. That's okay for this test. We'll do it one more time here. Actually not bad. Pretty thin shaving. Most of the time wide. You can tell where it was low right here. Alright, so that was actually not too bad. Okay, we just tested the Stanley 22 with the frog all the way towards the rear of the plane, the cutter resting on the original bed, no shims, and a relatively large mouth. It did okay. Not great, but okay. Now we're going to test it with a shim under the cutter. You can see the mouth is now much smaller, and if you look carefully, maybe you can see it on camera, you can even see the shim underneath there. Let's see how well it works. Sort of okay, a little bit jumpy. I just jointed this board, so maybe there's some irregularities. Let's try it again. Just a hair, let's try just a hair deeper. Yeah, That might be better than it was before. Let's slap some wax on that sole real quick and see if that helps, because it felt a little sticky there. Wax. Quick and easy to do. All right, now let's try her again. Just kind of need some speed on this one, I guess. Okay. My feeling is that made it better, but I wouldn't say that's a night and day difference. But it's a technique that works. I mean, so clearly I put a shim under there, the plane still functions. If you need to, you can use this method to make your mouth tighter, your plane mouth tighter. Okay, let's move on to the 122. Now we're going to take a shaving with the Stanley number 122 Liberty Bell plane. What you're going to see with this test is the result of about 2 to 3 hours of trying to get this thing to work. I have larger versions where I have also resoled the plane. They were generally not controversial. Put the new sole on, worked just fine, had no problems. For some reason, I had a lot of trouble getting this little booger to work. So maybe it's not a good representative of a Liberty Bell transitional plane. Maybe we'll come back and revisit the other family members in a later video. But for right now, let's just take a shaving and see how well it works. Alrighty then. Did I leave it anywhere close? Yeah. It's okay, not great. Okay, just went a little slower there, trying to be careful about keeping the plane in contact with the wood. Nice thin shaving, a little bit variable in width. Not as good as, you know, other smoothers that we've used here in the Handplane challenge. This plane has a noted tendency to try to clog up the throat. I'm not sure why that is. The mouth is not especially narrow or wide. Let's do one more time. Yeah, working pretty good. Ordinarily, I would not call that necessarily a bad result, except in this case, it took, you know, 2 to 3 hours of hard labor to get to that point. So, you know, maybe it'll work fine from here on out. I don't know. Time will tell. You know, but the whole tuning process, pulling out every trick that I know of to get it to work correctly, and it's basically gotten to this point. So not bad, but I doubt it's going to make it into my top 10 of favorite smoothing planes. Okay, lastly, let's try out the Gage No.2. I pretty much have not done anything to this in the way of tuning. All I've really done is sharpen the cutter. So let's see how well it takes the shaving. Could be down just a tad, a little. Pretty effortless, nice thin shaving. Pretty much in the middle. We always something to test with a gauge plane. Oops. Trying to keep the plane on the wood. Alrighty. Needs just a little more depth, I think. I might have put a little more camber on this. You never can tell. That's a little more deep. There we go. Yeah, pretty wide shaving, a little thicker than before because I had to set it a little deeper, but compared to the other two, this is a nice shaving, whole length of the board, nice and wide. If you want to be more subtle about your shaving, you'd back off a little bit and get a little less wide shaving, but I would say that the Gage No.2 worked pretty good. And that's about all we need to say on that one. Alrighty then, what have we learned today? For the Stanley 22, I closed up the mouth by putting a shim under the cutter, advancing the frog and putting a shim under the cutter. That seemed to be an improvement, so I would have to say that is a fix that one could consider using on any transitional plane. Furthermore, this 22 maintains the typical Bailey adjuster, so it has a lot of the normal attractive features of a regular metal Stanley Bailey plane. So in the end, it could be considered a usable plane. Second, the Stanley 122, I attempted to close up the mouth by re-soling the plane. That was, on this particular plane, that was only moderately successful. The plane still has a definite tendency to get clogged up in the throat. And there's some aspects of this plane that I don't like that much. It's the depth adjustment feature is fairly finicky. and of course you have to manually do lateral adjustment. Now, resoling a plane is not always a bad idea. I have done this with larger Liberty Bell planes and it worked out just fine. So I don't know exactly why it didn't work as well with this plane. Maybe it's the small size, I don't know. So of all three planes, this was the one I was least satisfied with. Lastly, the Gage No.1. As I've commented in the previous video, it has certain idiosyncrasies, the gauge mechanism does. You know, it's hard to see down into the throat to set the chip breaker. You know, if you want to set it really close to the edge of the cutter, it's a little bit difficult to do. It also has no on-purpose lateral, no actual active lateral adjustment feature. You have to loosen the screw and manually move it back and forth, so that's a bit of an idiosyncrasy. However, the design of this plane is great as a transitional. You literally have a metal plane where it counts, a large metal section here. So really all you have to do is take your wooden sole and try to match it up with that metal piece and you're good to go. It has a lot of travel in the adjustment to move the cutter up and down, the whole mechanism, to move the whole mechanism up and down. And so you can do a lot of truing before you need to resole the plane. And if you do need to resole the plane, well, it's pretty trivial. You just slap a new sole on there, and as long as you can chop a square hole in it that sort of matches where this insert should be, you're good to go. And furthermore, when it came to actually taking a shaving, this felt much superior to the other two. So all in all, in terms of design and usability, I rank the Gage No.1 as a clear winner. The Stanley 22, a sort of distant runner-up, and bringing up the rear, the Stanley 122. If you like the Handplane Challenge video series, please consider subscribing. If you like this particular video, please leave a comment, pro or con. I like to see them both. Helpful criticism is a good thing, and we'll see you next time on the Handplane Challenge.